Hi gang, John O'Brien here, your video professor for History 1520, Jamestown Community College, sunyjcc.edu. We're working our way through Traditions and Encounters, Bentley, Ziegler, Salter. Tonight we'll do the final parts of Chapter 32, Imperialism. Just checking the news today, stimulus bill delayed in the Senate. So keep an eye on that. The government trying to stimulate the economy given the rapid and major contraction due to the COVID-19 crisis. Hopefully this is not a crisis, but we do have a test coming up. I'm going to post a test tonight. It's Wednesday, the 25th. It will be due on Wednesday, April the 1st at 6 p.m. That is actually a couple days longer than our syllabus announced initially. So we are staying in line with our syllabus, same chapters, but I'm giving you 2 extra days for the test. So I'll post the questions tonight. The exam will be entirely essay based. It'll be 3 essays, 33.3 points each. It'll be due a week from today, again, by 6 p.m. You may not use any sources other than these lectures and our textbook. So the way Blackboard works, when you submit an essay or essays to it, it will run it through an anti-plagiarism program, and if it overlaps with something that's already been published, like your roommate's paper or something on Wikipedia, we'll flag it. And if there's more than a 10% overlap, we can't give you credit for that. So please do your own work and don't take advantage of the situation. We're all dealing with this crisis right now. Try to do your work. Your education is vitally important, especially once the economy gets going again, which actually might take some time. So you're going to be graduating and hopefully into a rebounding economy. You're going to want to have value behind that. Sort of the dogs in the background again. Sorry for the interruption. You're going to want that value of your education. So I am checking discussion. So let's see what's happened since last time we put a discussion board. Okay. Hey, Joseph, Perry, Daniel Sisson, and myself, John O'Brien, we've been discussing things, but I don't see any other posts from anyone else. So please get on the discussion board. This is the only way I'm taking attendance. So Daniel and Joseph, you guys are good. Do publish something else for tonight's lecture, but the rest of you really need to get in there. Okay? Please make sure your email is set to accept announcements from Blackboard. That's how I'm pushing stuff out to you guys. The syllabus, the test itself, quiz announcements. No quiz this week, but just general announcements. They'll come at you probably 2 or 3 times a week. Check your email, right? Or check Blackboard announcements. Where do we leave off? We left off with chapter 32, Imperialism, and let's just get this set up here quickly. We spoke about imperialism in Africa, how European powers essentially carved up an entire continent with a couple exceptions. Liberia, which in some ways was an American foothold, especially the Firestone Tire Company taking rubber out of the trees there, and Ethiopia, which had its own weaponry for a while. However, Italy will conquer Ethiopia using mustard gas and all types of nasty modern fascist warfare under Mussolini in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Other than that, the French, in this map in green, claiming most of West Africa. Looks good on the map, doesn't it? C'est bon, oui. Why? I mean, the goal is geostrategic, right? To claim Africa before another power does. Also to take raw materials from Africa. Well, this is largely desert, folks. Okay, there's not going to be a lot of raw material there other than sand. And also to guarantee markets for your national goods. So French products, but really, there weren't a lot of people in the Sahara. These regions, yes. In fact, this region of Africa growing today tremendously in population, which leads to predictions that French will become one of the top 5 languages again on the earth. Okay, with many French speakers here in the coming decades. In light purple, at least this shade of purple, the British, stretching down from Egypt, the Suez Canal, all the way to South Africa, where the British had conquered the frankly light-skinned Boer people, B-O-E-R people, the Afrikaans, the descendants of Dutch settlers, with industrial-grade weapons. Germans don't get much, right? Germany had only recently been unified, and of late to the scramble here, which will, in some ways, lead to German feeling of insignificance in some ways. Germany wanted to be a great power saved up great colonies. Germany doesn't get many because essentially it was late, right? It unified in 1871, and the scramble was already on soon thereafter. In fact, this map, hard to see there, 1870. Boy, I got to check this. I can't even see here. Mid 1870s, the colorful regions here showed what's dominated by foreigners. Hardly any of Africa, except for the Boers, the Dutch in the south. What a takeover in the coming centuries by these industrialized powers. Right? Situation in Asia, somewhat different. Parts of Asia directly claimed. In orange here we have actually parts of Persia, Afghanistan, at least part of it, Pakistan today, most of India, either directly in orange or indirectly. The British couldn't be everywhere, so they did have Mughal rulers, Raj, small petty kings ruling in their name, stretching into Myanmar or Burma, and having a buffer nation of Siam between the British and the French here, who take Indochina or Indochina. The Dutch extended their old colonial holds in Indonesia and New Guinea, the Japanese into Korea, and eventually into Manchuria, right? The Russians moving eastward, the Japanese industrialized navy moving westward, came to a war here, Battle of Tsushima and the Russo-Japanese War. Again, the Japanese won. This should all be reviewed. We're going to talk a bit more about this today. The Philippine Islands taken from Spain by the United States, but 70 million Filipinos there, most of whom wanted their independence. Okay, so the United States will be a player. What's not shown on the map here, but will be on the next one, is at the same time the United States claims the Philippines, the United States also takes Hawaii. Hawaii had experienced a revolution by Yankee American settlers there against the Queen. Grover Cleveland, to his credit, rejected the annexation of Hawaii, but William McKinley will take it, because essentially here's California, here's China, and this is in a sense halfway across the Pacific, right? And in the era of coal-powered vessels, you needed coaling stations. At least that was the claim. The British claimed Australia beginning in the 1780s, New Zealand as well. This is our topic for today. Leaving anyone out? Yes, almost too small to see. Some of the French claims, okay, Tahiti, for example. The Germans, some of these Caroline Islands will play a key role in World War II, not by that time in the hands of the Germans, actually, but in the hands of the Japanese, who will actually enter World War I and pick up against Germany. Right? People forget this. In World War I, Japan entered against Germany, saw no combat in Europe, and instead picked up German possessions in the Pacific. So let's look for a moment to European Australia and New Zealand, called kind of Terra Nullius, the unknown continent. The Dutch had made some claims. They spotted an unknown continent, especially James Cook sailing for Britain in the late 1780s, who moves into Australia. The Aboriginal people, from my reading of Cook's logs, basically tried to ignore the Europeans showing up in these huge ships and strange-looking people. The Aboriginal people of Australia essentially tried to ignore them, but they were not to be ignored, right? The British were coming. Although the land initially was really inhospitable for the British, it was too dry to farm without modern irrigation. They're going to send sheep herders to Australia and eventually so-called criminals. And to be a criminal in Britain in the 1780s and 90s meant that you were poor. Okay, you're standing on the streets, you're accused of prostitution or pauperism, okay, you're loitering, and you'd be sent on a ship. And in fact, many of the poor sent to Australia from Britain did not survive the voyage. Okay, they died en route. Okay. In New Zealand, the Maori people stood and fought against the British. Again, even by the 1790s, we begin to have somewhat industrialized weaponry in the hands of the British, cannons on their ships, etc. And the Maori people will fall to British rule. So by 1788, Australia becomes a prison colony for Britain, but keep in mind these people weren't generally convicted in a fair trial. Okay? Basically, they were poor people the British government wanted to get rid of, and they could no longer send them to the colony of Georgia, all right? The United States was independent. Voluntary migrants followed, again, often poor people, until gold was discovered in 1851, and then people from around the world who had the means to get to Australia go searching for gold. Of course, this is just a couple years after the great strike, gold strike in California. Disease will devastate the native peoples of both islands, similar to that experienced by native people in the Americas after 1492, right? And we're dealing kind of with this, hopefully not on this level, but kind of novel epidemics, right? Or virgin soil epidemics when a disease comes for the first time and people have no acquired immunity to it, right? Much more deadly things like smallpox than the coronavirus that would devastate entire societies, because generally it took out older people, the parents, the people who are the productive members of society. Europeans might contract smallpox as children, and this is tragic, but you know, when a toddler dies, it doesn't have a huge impact on the economy the way the deaths of many adults would. So New Zealand, the Maori are forced to sign a treaty of surrender, and the British placed New Zealand under its so-called protection. Okay, imperialism will be experienced in the Pacific Islands. Whalers, where do you think oil came from in this period, early 1800s? It's not till the 1850s that oil is being pumped out of the ground anymore. In fact, that's not too far from where I'm standing, Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1859. Prior to that was taken from the fat of whales, right? So it's great whaling vessels, right? You read Herman Melville, Moby Dick. Whalers wanted ports, missionaries sought souls, I guess steamships sought coaling stations, right? And the British, the French, the Germans, and Americans carved up what was left on the globe, what was not already kind of claimed by the great powers here in the South Pacific. Okay? What about the United States? The United States in the 1820s stated, without really the power to enforce it, the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe basically said, hey, the Latin American nations are free and independent for the most part, not yet Brazil and not yet Cuba or Puerto Rico, but for the most part, free of Spanish and European rule in general. So Europeans are not allowed back on this side of the hemisphere. Keep your own business. Right? So the United States already beginning to flex its muscles in the very early industrial era in the United States. Soon after the Civil War, the United States purchases Alaska from Russia and then establishes a protectorate over Hawaii. So the United States Navy is going to keep other powers out of Hawaii. American missionaries go to Hawaii to try to convert the native people there, spreading disease in the meantime. And their children often became sugar growers and pineapple growers and decided to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. The president at that time, Grover Cleveland, as I mentioned at the outset, refused to annex. I guess to his credit, he's not very good to American workers, but at least to the people of Hawaii, he did not want to annex this island chain, because it would be very hard to defend, as the United States found out in December 1941. But William McKinley will work to annex the islands in 1898, because the United States at that time was taking the Philippines, and this was, in a sense, halfway to the Philippines. Philippines, how does this come about? Well, in the Spanish-American War. So, revolution in Cuba, one of the few colonies left in the Western Hemisphere still under Spanish rule, other than Puerto Rico. Revolutionaries in Cuba, insurrectos, rose up against the Spanish government. The American press, no Fox News back then to hype up the news. Sorry, Fox watchers, leave some comments if you like. But the yellow press really hyped up, or even sexed up, the fight, the Cuban revolutionaries against this old Spanish, right, European monarchy. And the Americans began to take sides. McKinley puts a battleship, the USS Maine, into Havana Harbor on February 15th, 1898. It blows up, right? The American press immediately blames Spanish treachery for doing this. They blame the Spanish for setting up concentration camps to concentrate the people from the villages in the, basically barbed wire encampments where all types of diseases broke out. McKinley is pushed to war. Remember the Maine, the name of the ship that held with Spain, and the United States goes to war. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, orders the Asiatic Squadron out of Hong Kong into Manila Bay, the Philippines, because that too was a Spanish colony, and the Spanish Navy is essentially decimated in the harbor by a new steel-hulled American Navy. The Americans soon realized, however, they only had sailors, they didn't have Marines to kind of storm the beaches, and they needed the Filipinos, the guerrilla. Guerrilla is a Spanish word. We're not talking about gorillas as primates. Guerrilla means small-scale war. The Filipino nationalists to lead the land fight until American troops could arrive. Okay? So Spain loses the Philippines, it loses Cuba, it loses Puerto Rico. The United States will claim Puerto Rico as a commonwealth, as a protectorate. It almost takes Cuba, but under the Teller Amendment, Congress promised not to take Cuba as a state or colony, but just to defend it. Although the United States does take Guantanamo Bay like forever, okay, until we and the Cubans both decide that our lease is up. So what happens? Spain is defeated in this kind of so-called splendid little war. It takes a few months. More Americans die of disease than die of combat injury. I guess you get Teddy Roosevelt running up Kettle Hill, claiming he's riding up, San Juan Hill, which gives him some fame, so he can run for governor and then vice president and eventually president later. So Spain is defeated, right? But the Filipinos want their independence, right? Filipino, most of them, wanted their independence from Spain. Looked like they were going to get it, but then the United States claims the Philippines essentially as a colony. William McKinley would later claim that he got down on his knees, prayed about the Philippines, and he felt that he should uplift and civilize these people, who were actually, most of them, many of them anyway, the ilustrados, the upper class of the Philippines, quite well educated, had been educated in Europe, Catholic since probably the 1500s. Not all of them were Catholic, by the way. There was a large Muslim population in the south of the Philippines. But here we go, right? McKinley doesn't even know where the Philippines is until someone shows him on a map. And the United States, a democratic republic, becomes an imperial nation. Now, there were a lot of Americans against this imperialism. Some famous names on all ends of the political spectrum. People like Jane Addams, a great social worker in Chicago. Andrew Carnegie, great steel magnate based in Pittsburgh, right? Samuel Gompers, labor leader for the FFL. Perhaps most famously, or at least most vocally, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, the great satirist and novelist. So, and also there were anti-imperialists in Congress who actually hated imperialism because they were racist. So they felt like if Philippines becomes a colony, then Filipinos can come into the United States, and they just didn't want people of darker skin tone and Asiatic descent to show up in the United States. So racism plays a huge role in this so-called white man's burden. That was Rudyard Kipling's poem to white Americans, like, it's your burden. Send forth the best ye breed. You know, go uplift these Filipino people, quote unquote, half devil and half child. Okay, so this is unfortunately, I don't want to say a great age of racism, but an age of very pervasive racism among white people towards folk of other skin tone. Okay? The Filipinos will fight against the United States. Emilio Aguinaldo, great Filipino nationalist, will wage a conventional war and then a guerrilla war. He will be captured in some subterfuge where Americans kind of dressed up as prisoners and Filipino collaborators dressed up as guerrilla fighters and march Frederick Funston into Aguinaldo's camp, and then he takes off his arm, you know, he's not tied together. He takes off the ropes, and they capture Aguinaldo, which is a war crime today to do that type of thing. The Americans would also use different forms of torture, so waterboarding, basically pouring water, forcing water down a captured person, be he a fighter or not's throat until their stomach expanded, and then jumping on the stomach until the person vomited. All types of nasty, nasty things that often in the United States high school teachers don't like to cover, or maybe don't know this stuff, or would hope that Americans would not do this type of thing. But look, we weren't alive then. We shouldn't be guilty for what happened, but let's try to make sure that racism does not play a role in any future conflicts. Yes, Theodore Roosevelt. Okay. Roosevelt goes from being Assistant Secretary of the Navy to Governor of New York, Vice President of the United States. McKinley will be shot in Buffalo, New York in 1901. And Teddy Roosevelt, I believe 42 years old, which is fairly young, became President of the United States. And at home, he's this great progressive, right? He's going to reform society and big government and help the poor, at least working class poor. But on a national stage, he's kind of a big bully, right? Wielding this big stick. So during the Spanish-American War, naval planners realized it took a long time for naval ships to get from California to Cuba. They had to go all around the tip of Tierra del Fuego. So an isthmus canal through the narrow part of the Americas was necessary. And U.S. government offered money to Colombia. I think it was $10 million. Colombia said no, get lost. So the United States helped to foment a revolution by Panama, which was a state, essentially, of Colombia to break away, to secede. The U.S. Navy intervened to prevent Colombian troops from putting down the revolution. Panama became its own country under some French dude who wanted to build a canal. I forgot his name. You can look it up. The United States then bought the canal rights from this brand new nation of Panama. So here we go, kind of the big stick in the Americas. Okay? Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And picking up where James Monroe left off in 1823, Roosevelt said, not only Europeans stay out of this side of the world, don't intervene, but we will intervene for you. If Latin American nations owe you money, we'll go in and collect it for you and pay off you Germans or British or French or others. Japanese expansion. Look, the Japanese are expanding as well. We spoke about it previously. Into Korea, Taiwan, starting to eye northern China, Manchuria. Okay? They purchased warships from Britain. They were trained by the British Navy. Look, the Japanese looked up to Britain, another island nation that had a great worldwide empire. Why can't Japan do the same thing, right? So they go to war against China, 1894, 1895. 10 years later against Russia, for the defeat of both of those powers, right? Russia lost to the great shock of light-toned racists around the world that somehow a Russian, who were seen as European, of course it's multi-ethnic, but Russians who were seen as a European power were defeated by an Asian power. How could this happen, right? Teddy Roosevelt is wondering how this can happen. In fact, he helps to negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth that brought an end to that war. And this great kind of belligerent guy he was gets the Nobel Peace Prize for doing so. The legacies of imperialism. Lands were colonized to exploit the resources, including their human resources. It's not to put factories in Africa or Asia. It's to take raw materials out and hopefully to sell manufactured goods to the people living there. Usually the people were too poor to buy anything